The Abandoned Carnival. It was the middle of summer when a group of friends decided to explore the Abandoned Carnival on the outskirts of town. They had heard the stories about the carnival being cursed, about how anyone who dared to enter its gates would never return. But they were young and curious, and so they set out one evening, armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure. As they approached the gates of the carnival, they noticed that they were covered in rust and peeling paint. The once bright and colorful carnival rides were now faded and overgrown with weeds. It was clear that the place had not been in operation for many years. As they made their way through the deserted carnival, they noticed that something felt off. The air was thick with an eerie silence, and there was a feeling of unease that settled over them. They entered a decrepit furnace, the old mirrors inside distorting their reflections. But as they made their way through the dark and twisting corridors, they began to notice that their reflections were not the only ones in the mirrors. Faces that were not there stared back at them, twisted in pain and despair. The group began to panic and tried to find their way out of the furnace, but the maze-like corridors seemed to lead them in circles. As they stumbled out of the furnace, they found themselves in a clearing, surrounded by a group of abandoned carnival rides. The group felt a sense of relief, as the rides seemed to be the only familiar things in the place. But then they heard a faint sound that seemed to be coming from deep within the carnival. It was a haunting melody, played on an old organ, and it seemed to be calling out to them. The group followed the sound, their flashlights illuminating the way. They soon found themselves standing before an old tent. The source of the music, the tent was tattered and torn, but the sound coming from inside was clear and distinct. As they entered the tent, they were greeted by the sight of a lone figure sitting at an old organ. The figure was cloaked in darkness, and its face was obscured by the shadows. The music stopped abruptly, and the figure turned to face them. Its face was twisted in a snarl, and its eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The figure spoke, its voice echoing through the empty carnival. "Should not have come here," it said. "This place is cursed, and those who enter never leave." The group tried to leave the tent, but they found that the entrance was blocked by an unseen force. The figure began to play the organ once more, its haunting melody filling the air. As the group looked on in horror, the carnival rides around them began to come to life. The Ferris wheel spun around, the roller coaster rattled to life, and the carousel began to turn. The group realized then that they were trapped, that they were the playthings of a vengeful spirit that haunted the Abandoned Carnival. They were never seen or heard from again, and the Abandoned Carnival became known as a place where the living dared not venture, for it was said that the spirits of the carnival still roamed the grounds, waiting to claim their next victim. The end. The Abandoned Orphanage. As soon as she saw the old orphanage on the edge of town, Sarah knew that she had to explore it. There was something about the building that called out to her, something that made her feel like she had to see what was inside. So one night, when everyone else in the town was asleep, Sarah snuck out of her house and made her way to the orphanage. As she crept through the overgrown grass and pushed open the creaky old door, Sarah felt a sense of excitement wash over her. She had always been drawn to old abandoned buildings, and this one was no different. As she made her way through the dark, musty hallways, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and she could hear strange noises coming from the rooms around her. But she pressed on, drawn deeper into the heart of the orphanage. It was only when she reached the basement that she realized the true horror of the place. There, in the center of the room, was a circle of old rusted cages, and in each cage there was a child, or what was left of a child. Their eyes were sunken, their skin stretched taut over their bones. They looked like they had been starved and tortured for years, and Sarah realized with horror that this was exactly what had happened. She tried to turn and run, but she was rooted to the spot, and that was when she heard the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Sarah looked around, trying to find a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah felt a sense of panic wash over her. She was going to die here, just like the children in the cages. But then, a figure appeared before her, a tall, dark figure, dressed all in black. It was the same figure that she had seen in her nightmares for years, the one that had always scared her. The figure reached out and touched her, and Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She realized that this was the same figure that had been haunting the orphanage, the one that had been keeping the children trapped in their cages. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was cold and menacing, and Sarah realized with a sense of horror that this was no human being. This was something else entirely. "You should not have come here," it said. "This place is mine." Sarah tried to run, but the figure was too fast. It grabbed her by the arm and pulled her closer, its eyes glowing in the darkness. And then everything went black. When Sarah woke up, she was back in her bed. She tried to tell herself that it had all been a dream, that she had never really gone to the orphanage. But deep down, she knew that it was all too real, and she knew that the figure in black was still out there, waiting for its next victim. The end. The Haunted Carnival. It was a warm summer evening when Sarah and her friends decided to visit the old carnival that had been abandoned for years. The carnival had once been a popular attraction, but after a series of accidents and deaths, it had been shut down for good. Sarah had always been fascinated by the idea of exploring abandoned places, and so she convinced her friends to come along with her. As they entered the carnival grounds, they were struck by the eerie silence that enveloped the area. The rides were rusted and creaky, and the game booths were covered in cobwebs. It was as if time had stood still in this place, frozen in a perpetual state of decay. But as they explored further, they began to realize that something was not quite right. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and they started to hear strange whispers and moans coming from the shadows. They tried to shrug it off as their imaginations running wild, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched. The laughter and excitement they had felt upon entering the carnival had been replaced by a sense of dread. As they approached one of the game booths, Sarah noticed a strange symbol etched into the wood. It looked like an inverted pentagram, surrounded by arcane symbols. Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, and a thick fog rolled in. They tried to run, but it was as if the carnival was alive and wouldn't let them leave. They heard a high-pitched laughter and saw a figure in a clown costume standing in front of them. Its makeup was cracked, and its smile was twisted into a grotesque grin. The figure beckoned to them, and they were compelled to follow. As they walked, the carnival began to come alive around them, and they saw other figures emerging from the shadows. The once deserted carnival was now teeming with life, but it was a life that was twisted and evil. The figures led them to a tent that had not been there before. The tent was old and weathered, and it looked as if it had been there for centuries. The figures pushed them inside, and the door slammed shut behind them. Inside the tent, they saw a strange altar surrounded by candles. A figure in a dark robe stood before the altar, chanting in a language that none of them could understand. Sarah and her friends realized then that they had stumbled upon something far more sinister than they had anticipated. They had stumbled upon a gathering of dark cultists who were performing a ritual to summon an ancient evil. The cultists turned to face them, and the air grew thick with magic. The ground shook, and the air was filled with the sound of cackling laughter. Suddenly, the ritual reached its climax, and the ancient evil that had been summoned burst forth from the altar. It was a creature of pure darkness, with eyes that glowed like coals and teeth that gleamed like daggers. Sarah and her friends were paralyzed with fear as the creature approached them. They knew then that they were not going to make it out alive. But just as the creature was about to strike, the fog rolled back in, and the carnival fell silent. When the fog cleared, Sarah and her friends found themselves outside the carnival, unharmed. They realized then that they had narrowly escaped with their lives, but they knew that they had come dangerously close to falling victim to the ancient evil that lurked in the carnival. From that day on, they avoided the abandoned carnival, warning others to stay away. But they knew that the carnival would always be there, waiting for its next victim to come along and fall into its trap. The end. The long night. Sophie had just moved into her new apartment in the heart of the city. She had always wanted to live in a bustling metropolis, but now that she was there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first night in her new home was restless. She tossed and turned, listening to the sounds of the city outside her window. Cars honked, sirens wailed, and people shouted on the street below. But then there was something else, a sound she couldn't quite identify. It was a low, steady hum that seemed to be coming from inside the apartment. She got up to investigate, but found nothing out of the ordinary. She chalked it up to her imagination and tried to go back to sleep. But the hum persisted, and as the night wore on, it grew louder and more persistent. Sophie couldn't take it anymore. She got up and decided to take a walk to clear her air. As she walked through the dark streets, She noticed that there was something strange in the air. It was a feeling of unease, like someone was watching her. She tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't go away. Finally, she made her way back to her apartment, hoping that a good night's sleep would do her some good. But as she opened the door, she was greeted by a chilling sight. Every object in the room was levitating. As if caught in a vortex of some kind, the hum was now a deafening roar, and Sophie felt herself being pulled into the vortex. She closed her eyes and braced herself for the worst. But when she opened them again, she found herself in a dark, unfamiliar place. Sophie had no idea where she was or how she had gotten there. All she could see was darkness, a void that seemed to stretch out infinitely in every direction. She tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't respond. It was like she was stuck in place, frozen in time. She called out for help, but there was no response. But suddenly she heard a faint whisper in the distance. It was a voice, barely audible, but it seemed to be calling her name. Sophie started to move towards the voice, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she could make out the words being spoken. "Help me, Sophie, help me." The voice was coming from a figure in the distance, shrouded in darkness. She couldn't make out any features, but she knew that it was a person in need. Sophie began to run towards the figure, her feet pounding on the ground. But as she got closer, she realized that the person was not alone. There were other figures, dozens of them, all calling out to her for help. She tried to turn back, but it was too late. The figures had surrounded her, their eyes fixed on her with a haunting gaze. She realized then that she was not alone in the darkness. She was in the presence of something evil. Sophie woke up in her apartment, drenched in sweat. It had all been a dream, she realized, but it had felt so real. She got up and made her way to the kitchen, hoping that a cup of coffee would help her calm her nerves. But as she turned on the light, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Every object in the room was levitating, just like in her dream. The hum was back, and it was even louder than before. Sophie tried to make her way out of the apartment, but the door was stuck. She tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she realized that she was trapped in her own home. Suddenly, she heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice from her dream, the one that had called out to her for help. "Help me, Sophie, help me." Sophie tried to locate the source of the voice, but it seemed to be coming from all around her. She started to feel like she was losing her mind. Then, the objects in the room began to move as if being controlled by an unseen force. They started to swirl around her, creating a vortex that threatened to pull her in. Sophie closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, trying to keep calm. She knew that she had to find a way out of the apartment, and fast. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the object slowed down and came to a stop. Sophie saw her chance and made a run for the door. To her relief, it opened easily this time and she burst out into the hallway. But as she ran down the hallway, she realized that something was chasing her. It was a dark, shadowy figure moving at a rapid pace. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that it was not human. Sophie didn't stop running until she was outside. Gasping for air, she looked up at the building and saw that all the windows were dark, like the apartment had been abandoned for years. She knew then that something was not right about her new home. She had to get out of there, no matter the cost. Sophie started to investigate the history of the apartment building, hoping to find some clues as to what had happened there. She talked to the neighbors, searched online, and even went to the local library to look through old records. What she found was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The apartment building had been built on the site of an old asylum, a place where the mentally ill were treated in the most inhumane ways imaginable. Patients were subjected to electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other horrific treatments that were meant to cure them but only made their conditions worse. The asylum was eventually shut down, and the building was torn down to make way for the new apartment complex. But it seemed that the horrors of the past had never really left. Sophie realized that the figures she had seen in her dream were the spirits of the patients trapped in the darkness and seeking her help. But there was something else too, something more malevolent. She began to experience more strange occurrences in the apartment, like objects moving on their own and doors slamming shut. She knew that she was not alone, that there was something else in the apartment with her. Sophie knew that she had to get out of the apartment, but she also knew that the spirits of the past deserved to be set free. She began to research ways to communicate with them, hoping to find a way to help them move on. Finally, after weeks of research, she found a ritual that was said to be able to communicate with spirits. She gathered the necessary materials and performed the ritual in her apartment, calling out to the spirits to show themselves. To her shock, the spirits appeared before her, their ghostly forms hovering in the air, but as she reached out to touch them, they transformed into something else entirely. They became dark, shadowy figures, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. Sophie realized then that she had made a terrible mistake. She tried to flee, but the shadowy figures surrounded her, pulling her into the darkness. She knew then that she was going to die, that she had been foolish to try and communicate with the spirits of the past. But then a figure appeared before her. It was the same figure that had called out to her in her dream, the one that had asked for her help. The figure radiated a sense of calm and safety, and Sophie knew that she had to follow it. The figure led her through the darkness, away from the shadowy figures and towards a light. As they drew closer, Sophie realized that the light was coming from an old door, covered in rust and peeling paint. The figure opened the door, revealing a staircase that led down into the earth. Sophie hesitated for a moment, unsure of what lay ahead, but the figure urged her forward. As she descended the staircase, Sophie felt a sense of unease wash over her. She realized that she was in the same place where the asylum had once stood, where the patients had been subjected to unspeakable horrors. But as she reached the bottom of the staircase, she saw something that made her blood run cold. That in the center of the room was a figure that she recognized from her dreams. It was the same figure that had called out to her for help. The figure was chained to the wall, its body covered in scars and bruises. Sophie realized that this was one of the patients from the asylum, trapped in this place for decades. She approached the figure and asked it how she could help. The figure spoke, its voice weak and raspy. "Set us free," it said. "Set us all free." Sophie realized then that the spirits of the past were not just trapped in the apartment building, but in this place as well. She knew that she had to find a way to release them. With the help of the figure that had led her to this place, Sophie worked to free the spirits. She broke the chains that bound them, and together they climbed back up the staircase and out of the darkness. As they emerged into the light, Sophie felt a sense of peace wash over her. The spirits of the past were finally free, and she had helped to set them on their way. Sophie left the apartment building, never to return. She knew that the horrors of the past had been too much to bear, and that she needed to move on with her life. But she also knew that she had been given a gift, the ability to communicate with the spirits of the past. She vowed to use that gift to help others, to ensure that no one else would ever have to experience the horrors that she had endured. The end. The shadow at the end of the hall. The Jones family had just moved into a new house on the outskirts of town. It was a large, old Victorian house with creaky floorboards and a musty smell. The family didn't mind the quirks of the old house. They were just happy to have a new home. The Joneses had 3 children, Emily, Michael, and Samantha. Emily was the oldest at 12 years old, Michael was 10, and Samantha was 8. They were all excited to explore their new home and make it there. As they unpacked their belongings, they noticed that there was a door at the end of the hallway that was locked. The previous owners had left it that way, and the Joneses didn't think much of it. That night, the Jones family went to bed. Emily was in her room, Michael was in his, and Samantha was in hers. As they were falling asleep, Emily noticed a shadow moving at the end of the hall. She got out of bed and walked towards it. The shadow seemed to be moving closer to her. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Just as the shadow was about to touch her, it disappeared. Emily went back to bed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about their new home. The next day, Michael and Samantha both reported seeing the same shadow at the end of the hall. They all agreed that there was something strange about the house. The Joneses decided to explore the house to try to find out what was going on. They tried to open the locked door at the end of the hallway, but it wouldn't budge. They decided to get a locksmith to come and unlock it. When the locksmith arrived, he tried to open the door, but when he did, he was hit with a strong gust of wind that knocked him off his feet. He refused to open the door and left the house, wanting the Joneses to leave the door locked. That night, they had a dream. She dreamt that she was standing at the end of the hallway, and the locked door was open. She walked inside and found herself in a dark, creepy room. In the room, there was a figure sitting in a chair. It was hard to make out its features, but Emily could tell that it was staring at her. The figure stood up and started to walk towards her. Emily tried to run, but her feet were stuck to the ground. The figure reached out and touched her when she woke up. The next night, Michael had a similar dream. He dreamt that he was walking down the hallway, and the locked door was open. He walked inside and found himself in the same dark, creepy room. In the room, the figure was sitting in the chair, just like in Emily's dream. This time the figure spoke to him. It said, "Get out of this house before it's too late." The Joneses knew that they had to do something about the strange occurrences in their new home. They called in a priest to perform an exorcism on the house. The priest walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and chanting prayers. When he got to the locked door at the end of the hallway, he hesitated for a moment, but then he unlocked the door. A powerful gust of wind blew through the hallway, but the priest stood his ground. He entered the room, and inside he found a small, old-fashioned bedroom with a dusty, unmade bed and an empty bookcase. The priest felt a presence in the room and knew that he had to perform the exorcism quickly. He started to chant louder and more forcefully, sprinkling holy water on every surface he could reach. Suddenly a deep, guttural voice spoke out from the corner of the room. "Leave this house now, priest," it boomed. The priest continued his chanting undeterred, but the voice grew louder and more threatening, and the room grew colder and darker. The Joneses watched in horror as the priest struggled against the evil presence in the room. Suddenly, the figure from Emily and Michael's dreams appeared in the doorway, blocking the exit. The priest turned to face the figure, and the two engaged in a fierce spiritual battle. The priest held out his crucifix and chanted even louder, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream. Finally, the room fell silent. The priest collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. The figure had disappeared, and the presence in the house was gone. The Jones family never experienced anything strange in their new home again. They were grateful to the priest for freeing their house from whatever evil presence had been there before. But they never forgot the shadow at the end of the hall, or the figure in the locked room. They knew that they would always carry the memory of their frightening experience with them. Years later, Emily, Michael, and Samantha had all moved out of the house. But they still talked about the strange events that had occurred there. They knew that they would never forget the shadow at the end of the hall, or the chilling dreams that had haunted them for years to come. The end.